What would you do if you moved into a house you thought was empty, only to realize it wasn't just the walls that were watching you? A few years ago, I found what seemed like the perfect rental, an old Victorian home with history, charm, and a rent price that couldn't be beaten. But what started as a dream quickly turned into a nightmare filled with strange noises, eerie shadows, and unsettling encounters that couldn't be explained away. These are the true, unsettling, haunted house stories that will make you wonder if you're ever truly alone in your own home. But before we get lost in the shadows, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out our chilling upcoming episodes. If you're enjoying our eerie stories, leave a like, drop a comment, and share the terror with others. And for even more eerie content, follow us on social media. Keep the fear alive. Thanks for joining me on this spooky journey. Now, let's dive into the nightmare. My husband and I moved into our current home over 4 years ago. It's an old colonial house on Long Island, built in 1907. Ever since we've been living here, we've had some pretty strange experiences that I can't explain. The first one still creeps me out whenever I think about it. One day I left work early because I was feeling under the weather, a cold that I couldn't shake. I went straight upstairs to our bedroom, hoping to rest for a bit. I had just settled into bed when I suddenly heard the sound of footsteps. It was so clear, each step on the stairs, one after another. Our staircase is old, with 2 sets of stairs and a landing in between. I could hear someone making their way up the first set, pausing at the landing, and then continuing up the second set. The footsteps stopped right outside our bedroom door. At first, I thought it might be my husband coming home early, but then I realized he wouldn't be back for at least another hour. And honestly, I knew deep down that it wasn't him. My heart started racing and my whole body went rigid with fear. I didn't know what to do. When my husband did come home, I asked him if he had come in early, maybe gone back downstairs after. But he told me no, and he didn't really believe me. A month later, my husband had the same experience. He had stayed home from work one afternoon, and after lying down to take a nap, he heard the same footsteps coming up the stairs. He had to admit then that there might be something more to this. We weren't alone in the house. Fast forward to 2021, when we had our son, and that's when things got even weirder. One night I was up breastfeeding him and decided to sit in our living room so that my husband could sleep. He'd just gone back to work after his paternity leave, so I wanted to give him some rest. I was sitting in my big, comfy armchair, rocking our baby to sleep, when I suddenly heard footsteps from upstairs. I froze. I listened carefully. There was no sound of our bedroom door opening, so it couldn't have been my husband. About 10 minutes later, he did wake up to use the bathroom, and I called out to ask him if he'd been up earlier. He said no, he'd just gotten up to use the restroom. I was so freaked out by this that I refused to breastfeed downstairs again. From that point on, I only fed our baby in the bedroom. But the weirdest incident of all happened when my mum came to visit us for the first time after our son was born. She came to babysit so we could have our first official date night since becoming parents. We were out for dinner, and when we got home, my mum looked absolutely horrified. She told us that she had been sitting in the rocking chair, holding our son while he slept, when she suddenly heard footsteps outside the bedroom door. Then she heard 3 loud bangs, like someone was angrily pounding on the door. She said she jumped up and opened the door, but no one was there. She waited anxiously for us to return, and after that she was too scared to stay with us again. She hasn't been back since. After that, things seemed to quiet down for a while, though we still experienced the occasional strange occurrence here and there. Recently, though, our son, who's now older, told us that the walls in his room talk to him. it gave us chills, but we just tried to write it off as his imagination running wild, since he's still a toddler. But then something even stranger happened. A few months ago, we were having dinner with our son when, out of nowhere, he said, "I played with my grandpa yesterday." We assumed he was talking about my dad, but then he corrected us, saying, "No, not that grandpa. The other one." My husband and I exchanged confused looks. We asked him what the other grandpa looked like, and he said, "He looks like a girl with long hair, and he has wings that go up to the sky." I'll admit, I felt a strange mix of chills and comfort hearing that. My husband's father passed away several years ago, and he had always had long hair. The image our son described was so eerily specific that it made us both wonder, could this be some kind of sign? Could this spirit be my husband's dad watching over us and our son? It was unsettling, but it also brought a sense of peace. I'm still not entirely sure what to make of everything we've experienced, but I know one thing for sure. This house definitely has some kind of presence. Whether it's our loved ones trying to connect with us or something else entirely, I don't think we'll ever really know, but it's certainly one of the strangest things that's ever happened to us. I don't really know how to explain what happened to me, but it all started when I moved into an old house in a small town. I'll keep the name of the place private, but it was somewhere in the Midwest. The house itself was charming, at least on the surface. It was a 2-story Victorian that had been sitting empty for a few years before I rented it. The landlord said it was a steal, which should have been my first red flag, but I was too eager to move out of the city and start fresh. I was 24 at the time, living alone, and I didn't really believe in ghosts. I grew up hearing the usual stories, haunted houses, creepy urban legends, but I always brushed them off as superstition. That was until I stepped into this house. The first few weeks were uneventful. There was nothing strange about the house, creaky floors, old windows that rattled in the wind, but nothing that would make me think it was haunted. Then, things started to change. I remember one evening when I was sitting on the couch watching TV. The house had an old, grand staircase that led up to the second floor. I was alone, as usual, and the place was silent except for the hum of the TV. Suddenly I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps coming down the stairs. It wasn't the usual creaks the house made, it was more like someone was walking. I froze. The footsteps weren't just in my head, I could hear them. I didn't even have to move to confirm it. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. But when I checked, the hallway was empty. I figured it was the house settling, or maybe just my imagination, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. A few days later, things got worse. I was getting ready for bed when I noticed the lights flickering. It wasn't a power surge or anything like that. It was more like they were going on and off in some kind of rhythm. I tried to ignore it, but when I turned off the lights and got into bed, I could still hear it. Soft thumps from upstairs as if someone was walking around in the dark. The air grew cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. I got up, turned on the hallway light, and stood at the bottom of the stairs. No one was there. But then something happened that made me question everything. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my bedroom door slowly creaking open. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a draft, but I felt an undeniable pressure in the room, like someone was standing in the doorway. I didn't dare look. I just lay there, paralyzed, staring at the ceiling. The air felt thick and heavy, and the temperature in the room dropped. The worst part? I could hear breathing. Not mine, not the house's, but someone else's. Slow, deliberate, like they were waiting for me to make a move. I don't even know how long I lay there, but it felt like hours. Eventually, the door creaked closed and the breathing stopped. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a presence I could sense in the house. I went about my day, but by the time I got home, the house felt wrong. Over the next week, the strange occurrences escalated. I'd hear whispers when I was alone, footsteps following me around the house, lights flickering with no explanation. One day, I went into the kitchen and noticed the cupboard doors were wide open, even though I was sure I had closed them. But the most disturbing part happened when I was sitting at my kitchen table, eating breakfast. I looked up and saw something in the reflection of the window. A figure, standing just behind me, watching me. I turned around. Nothing was there. I felt like I was losing my mind. I started staying at friends' houses to avoid the place, but even when I wasn't there, I felt like the house was waiting for me to return. It's hard to explain, but I felt like something was attached to me. Finally, I reached out to the landlord. I asked him if anything strange had happened in the house before I moved in, but he denied it. He said it was just an old house and I was probably hearing things. But I wasn't the only one who had experienced weird stuff. A few neighbors mentioned that they had heard noises coming from the house when it was empty, but they never had the guts to investigate. Some even said the last tenants had moved out abruptly without a word. By the time I decided to leave, the house had become more of a nightmare than a home. It felt like the house wanted me there, like it was feeding off my fear. I packed up my things and left, but even after I moved out, the feeling lingered. To this day, I'm convinced the house was haunted. I don't know what it was or who or what was trying to reach me, but I'll never forget the sense of dread that lingered in every room. It's been years since I left, but I can still hear those footsteps sometimes, echoing in the back of my mind. Maybe it was just an old house settling. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, but whatever it was, I'll never step foot in a place like that again. This was the first and last time I ever went to a haunted house attraction. I live in Fort Worth, Texas, and every year there's this big haunted house that everyone talks about. My friends had been planning to go, and I figured it was finally time to experience it for myself. For some context, I've had a pretty rough childhood, which led me to develop PTSD. I'll touch more on that later, but that's important to understand the state I was in when this all went down. It was a weekend, so of course, nobody wanted to do this sober. My buddy Noah threw a little pre-game at his place before we headed out. It was 6 of us in total, 3 guys, 2 girls, and me. We smoked, drank, and joked around in Noah's backyard, all thinking that getting buzzed would make the haunted house experience more fun. We bought our tickets online while we were pre-gaming, and honestly, I wasn't too excited at first, but figured I'd just go with the flow. I don't smoke often, mostly because it makes me paranoid, but that night I figured I'd try again. After a few hits, I felt pretty good actually. The mix of alcohol and weed seemed to balance me out and keep my anxiety at bay. After we called an Uber, we drove about 20 minutes to the haunted house. When we got there, the line was massive, at least 30 minutes of waiting. The place was packed, and we started chatting with the people ahead of us in line. I was already feeling pretty cross-faded, but was still aware of what was going on. By the time we reached the front, I was starting to feel a little woozy, but I didn't mention it to anyone. I figured it'd be fine. We finally entered the haunted house, and from the moment we stepped inside, it was chaos. Loud screams, eerie sound effects, and the actors were great. Too great, honestly. They were intense, and I quickly realized I was not okay. The high I thought I could handle was starting to amplify everything. My heart raced, my palms sweated, and every little jump scare made me want to lose it. One actor, a guy dressed as some kind of horror character, must have noticed how freaked out I was because he decided to get in my face. He started yelling and making this creepy growling sound. I tried to stay calm, but it wasn't working. I was spiraling, mentally telling myself this was a mistake. I just wanted to get out of there. The next part of the house was a room lit in a blood-red glow. There was a guy in a bloody suit with a top hat yelling at us, his voice grating. But what caught my attention wasn't him. In the far corner, standing perfectly still, was someone who wasn't in costume, just a guy in normal clothes staring directly at me. It didn't click at first, but as I looked at him more closely, my blood ran cold. I realized I was staring at the face of my father. I froze, and before I knew it, I was screaming, loud, gut-wrenching, primal screams. My whole body tensed up. The room went silent, and my friends turned to look at me, laughing at first, thinking I was just trying to be dramatic. But when they saw my face, when they realized I wasn't joking, their laughter stopped. I pointed to the corner, but when they looked, there was no one there. I remember one of the girls grabbing me, asking what was wrong, but all I could say was, "It's my dad, it's my dad." My friends didn't understand. The actor who had been scaring us even asked if I was okay, but no one else had seen what I saw. At this point, I was in full-blown panic mode. I started yelling, "I want to leave! I want to leave!" Noah, being the one closest to me, grabbed me by the arm and guided me out through a side exit. He stayed with me while the rest of our group finished the attraction. I wasn't about to make them leave over something I couldn't explain. As we sat outside, trying to calm down, Noah tried to reassure me. "You're just hallucinating," he said. "Your dad isn't in there. It's just a haunted house, man." The thing is, my dad had been an abusive presence in my life when I was a kid. He left when I was 10, and I've carried the scars from that ever since. My friends knew about my troubled past, but they didn't know the details. They didn't need to. After the haunted house, we all went to a nearby Wendy's. I was just trying to eat something to settle my nerves, but I was embarrassed. Thankfully, no one judged me too harshly, or at least not to my face. I went home early that night. I didn't want to ruin their fun any more than I already had. I was exhausted, so I fell asleep almost immediately, still shaken up. But sleep didn't bring peace. I had a nightmare about the haunted house. I dreamt I saw my dad standing in that same corner of the room, glaring at me. He kept saying, "Wake up, Charlie." And when I did wake up, I wasn't in the dream anymore. I was in my bed, in my dark room. But then standing over me, towering above my bed, was my father. This version of him wasn't human. He was enormous, nearly 9 feet tall, and his body contorted in unnatural ways, his eyes wide open, staring down at me with an impossible intensity. My heart stopped and my blood turned to ice. It took a few seconds for my brain to process what I was seeing, but when it did, I screamed like I've never screamed before. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. My mum came rushing into the room and flicked on the light, and just like that, the apparition was gone. I was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face as I told my mum, "I saw Dad, I saw him." That night was one of the most terrifying, scarring experiences of my life. I haven't touched weed or any heavy substances since. I stick to light alcohol, and I swore I'd never go near a haunted house again. That experience was enough to last me a lifetime. It was the summer of 2018 when I moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was one of those houses with a lot of character, large, with creaky wooden floors, a grand staircase, and an attic that seemed to stretch on forever. It had been vacant for a while before I signed the lease, but the landlord assured me it was nothing but the usual wear and tear from an old house. The price was right, and I didn't mind the idea of having a big, quirky place all to myself. At first, everything seemed normal. I spent the first few weeks unpacking, getting settled, and enjoying the peace and quiet. The house had a quiet charm to it, even if it was a little spooky at night. I'd often hear the creaking of the floorboards above me when I was downstairs, but I figured it was just the house settling. The attic door was one of those heavy wooden doors with a brass handle that seemed to be stuck half the time, so I never really thought to open it, until one night. I'd been feeling a little on edge recently, nothing major, just a sense that the house wasn't as empty as I thought it was. Maybe it was because I'd watched too many horror movies, or maybe I was just tired, but one night I couldn't sleep. I was lying in bed when I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Scraping. The sound of something dragging across the floor, coming from directly above me. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of the house. It was deliberate, almost rhythmic, like something or someone was moving around up there. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just my imagination, but after a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I finally grabbed my phone and went to the attic door. It was dark, and I couldn't see anything through the small crack, but the scraping sound had stopped. I hesitated, then reached for the brass handle and turned it. The door creaked open, but I stopped just as it did. There was something in the air, something thick, heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. I couldn't see anything at first, but when my eyes adjusted, I saw a faint shape at the far end of the attic, near the window. It was a shadow. Not the kind of shadow cast by a piece of furniture or a stray light. This shadow seemed to be moving. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a stray bird outside or the wind. But when I flicked on the light, the shadow didn't disappear. It just stayed there, crouched low in the corner, unmoving. I had this overwhelming feeling that I wasn't supposed to be looking at it. I slammed the door shut, heart racing, and locked it. I didn't go back up there that night. In fact, I didn't go back up there for the next few weeks. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, but every time I walked past that door, I could feel something watching me from above. The next few days were uneventful until one afternoon when I returned home from work. The attic door was open. I know for a fact that I locked it before I left. I checked it every time I walked past. But that day, the door was open, just a crack. I thought maybe it was the wind, but there was no breeze. And even if there was, the door was old, heavy, and wouldn't just swing open like that. I went inside, slowly, not sure what to expect. The attic was darker now, dustier. The light bulb flickered as I stepped inside. My eyes darted around the room, and that's when I saw it. The floorboards. They were covered in dirt and dust, but there were fresh footprints, small, childlike, leading from the corner of the room toward the attic window. The same window where I'd seen the shadow weeks ago. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, that someone had been messing with me. But there was no way anyone could have gotten in without me noticing. The attic was sealed off from the rest of the house, and I was the only one with the key. That night I didn't sleep at all. I kept hearing things, the sound of footsteps, faint whispers, things moving in the attic. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went back up. This time, I was determined to face whatever it was. I opened the door slowly, heart pounding. The air in the attic was cold, colder than I remembered. The shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I shone the flashlight around the room, and that's when I saw it. The footprints, again. But this time, they were leading toward the back wall of the attic. I followed them, my feet dragging across the dusty floor. When I reached the wall, I noticed something odd. There was a small section of the wall that seemed different. It was not like the rest. I ran my hand along it, and my heart nearly stopped when I felt it shift. There was a door, hidden in plain sight, concealed by a layer of old wood and wallpaper. It was narrow, just big enough for a person to slip through, and it was slightly ajar. I didn't know what to do. My gut screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet carried me forward. I pushed the door open, and when the light from my flashlight spilled inside, I saw what was behind it. A small, dusty room. No furniture, just a few cobwebs and old boxes. But what caught my attention was the wall. There were scratch marks, deep, desperate marks carved into the wood. And as I moved closer, I could see the faint outline of a handprint smeared across the wall. It wasn't human, at least not the way we are. It was elongated, almost distorted. And below it, words were scratched in the wood. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, but clear enough to make out. "Help me, please. Don't leave me." I ran out of the attic, so fast I didn't even look back. I locked the door behind me, and I didn't go back up there after that. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him I was moving out. When he asked why, I couldn't bring myself to explain. I didn't think he'd believe me. I've been in a new place for the past year, and I haven't had any issues since. But every so often, I think about that attic, the hidden room, and the feeling of being watched. And every time I close my eyes, I swear I can still hear those footsteps echoing from the corner of my mind. Have you ever faced something truly terrifying? Eerie Shadows wants to hear your story. Share your chilling experiences with us on Reddit, and together we'll uncover the eerie mysteries lurking in the shadows. If you'd like to support the channel and help us create even more terrifying content, consider checking out our Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support helps us keep the horror alive. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more bone-chilling tales like this one. Stay tuned for the next eerie episode.